Archbishop Wensky's opening words provide an excellent introduction for what I've been asked to do with you here today, and especially in this opening presentation. It's called a roadmap to the reconciliation process, and I'll be explaining each of those terms here in a few minutes. But as Carlos Saladrigas said, and then the Archbishop also, there are many different understandings of what reconciliation is, and especially social reconciliation, where we're talking about larger groups. And the term trips rather easily off the lips of so many. I teach a course on reconciliation in Chicago every year, and a couple of years ago when General Petraeus was still in charge of the armed forces in Iraq, I had a soldier in the class who had just come back from Iraq, and he brought me the letter that General Petraeus had sent to all of the troops. The term reconciliation was in about every third line, not always meaning the same kind of thing. So the term is used widely, and it's used loosely, and also over time it accretes to itself meanings in particular communities. And that's already been alluded to here, that for some in the Cuban community, reconciliation is a dirty word. And it's not only in Cuba has that been the case. That was the case in Argentina after the Guerra Sucia, the dirty war there. The situation now has changed a bit. So it's used loosely, and then I think especially for people who have suffered harm are rightfully leery about what the word is meant to convey, especially when it's on the lips of those who have not suffered, who are kind of intruding themselves into the process, thinking they can bring reconciliation, and even worse, when it's on the lips of those who have inflicted the harm. That was the case in Argentina. The people said, oh, let's put the past behind us, let's go forward together. Almost consistently, the people who were saying that were the ones who had inflicted the harm. So I want to begin by what reconciliation is not, and then turn to what reconciliation is. First of all, reconciliation is not about forgetting the wrongdoing of the past as though it never happened. We have that phrase, forgive and forget, in English, and it's also in many other languages. And it's really bad advice. If something significant has happened to you in this way, has harmed you, injured you, violated you, you can't forget it. And to be forced to forget it is to be victimized once again. Reconciliation is not about that. We have to remember the past, and I'll talk in a few minutes here more about what that means. Secondly, reconciliation is not about condoning the wrongdoing, saying that it really doesn't matter, or it happened so long ago that we can do nothing about it. Reconciliation, as we're going to see, is about relationships, and we cannot simply set some relationships aside, even bad ones, if we want to have a better future. Reconciliation is also not the opposite of justice. One of the questions I get a lot is, well, what's the relationship between reconciliation and justice? Can you have reconciliation without justice? Or can you only have reconciliation when there's full justice? This is one of the knottiest questions to be addressed. I'll be talking a little more about it later. A lot has to do, we'll see, with what we mean when we say we want justice. What are we looking for? Reconciliation is also not about, and this has already been mentioned, about appeasing wrongdoers or giving them more time. So, as was noted, some Cubans have been reluctant to travel to Cuba because this, in a way, supports the totalitarian regime that is there. It gives them a little more income, it keeps them going. Reconciliation is not about that as well. And finally, reconciliation is not a false forgiveness. A forgiveness in which wrongdoers don't deal with the consequences of their actions. That's not reconciliation either. Sometimes the term reconciliation is used because people are frightened of dealing with all the conflict that has gone on. A fear that it's going to come back, or they will be overwhelmed by it. Well, after that litany of what reconciliation is not, what is reconciliation? Perhaps in its most simple form, reconciliation is about rebuilding right relationships, where those relationships have been broken, twisted, harmed in any kind of way. It is about rebuilding those relationships, sustaining those relationships, and being faithful to those relationships. So reconciliation is never about just one person, one wrongdoer, or one victim. It's about the relations between them. It's about rebuilding, first of all, trust. And trust can only be built if there's safety. Safety, trust. And it's a long process. The second thing I want to say about reconciliation, and it's really important for what we're trying to do here today, is that reconciliation is both a goal we hope to attain, an endpoint to a long and difficult path, but it's also the path itself. It's the process itself. I think most of us automatically jump to the end because we want to see what it's going to be and not think about everything that has to be done along the way. People say it's long, yes. Arduous, yes. Linear, no, it's not linear. It moves in and out all the time. Requires patience, yes, yes. But I'm going to focus today particularly on the process. And one of the reasons for that is the goal starts to look different as you go through the process. It's like if you go into the central part of the United States, in the flatlands of the plains, when you first see the Rocky Mountains in the distance, you kind of think you know what they are. And as you get closer, that picture changes. And so too, we see with what is reconciliation. What seems to be sometimes the most demanding at the beginning is not really the most important thing when we draw close. It's not linear, it's not quick, but it can be done. And as has already been pointed out, and we'll hear again here shortly, this is a question that's going on in so many different places in the world today. And a number of places are kind of in the situation in general that we are here with Cuba. We're perhaps just getting up to the cusp of a change. And the key then is to be ready for that and to know what we're able to do. So what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is give something of a roadmap. So, and by roadmap here, I don't mean recipe. That if you have 2 tablespoons of this, 2 teaspoons of that, and a pinch of something else, you'll have a formula that you can whip up and call reconciliation. Reconciliation doesn't work that way. There are parallels and similarities in different kinds of situations, but they're never the same because the histories aren't the same, the duration is not the same, and as a result of that, you can't simply impose a single strategy. Nor, if it's not a recipe, nor is it a GPS, where you can punch in where you want to go and then just follow it step by step, when you turn left, when you turn right, when you stop, and so on. Now, it's a roadmap in the sense to give you a sense of the bigger lay of the land that we have to deal with, the kinds of issues that are going to be coming, or have already, but will continue to come forward in this as we go. So let me launch then kind of into that. There are really 2 big parts to reconciliation as process, as I see it. 2 big parts. The first part is healing the past. So it's backward looking. It's looking back on what has happened. It's looking back and taking seriously what has happened, but also coming to realize that it is the past. And the question then becomes, how much are we going to allow the past to determine the future? The other half, healing the past, the other half is building that future. And I've said already that reconciliation is not a linear process. So this isn't sequential either, that first you finish healing the past and then you start building the future. No, they happen all together because they illuminate each other. They raise questions, as we'll see, for each other as we go along. So let me begin by talking about healing the past. In the case of Cuba, 54 years and counting of a past. The first thing we need to do is acknowledge the wounds that we carry as individuals and as a community. These are wounds of loss, betrayal, of acute suffering and continuing suffering, of division. These are all embedded in the stories we tell about what happened. And they must be acknowledged. And by acknowledged, I mean they must be made public in the sense that we don't carry them around just in ourselves, but others have a chance to hear them and to affirm them. Yes, this is what happened. This kind of making external of the wounds we carry is one of the key elements in dealing with them, because wounds tend to isolate us. And by making them external, where others can acknowledge them, we begin to bring them into a place where relationships can be rebuilt. It's important to realize that in this is a process of truth-telling that's very, very important. When you're dealing with a totalitarian regime, such as that the Castro government, you have a culture of lies that you have to deal with. You know, I've heard stories about what children are taught in school, the things they have to learn, that don't fit what they see around them. Lies sustain authoritarian governments. Lies about the people themselves, lies about the people who are enemies. And by acknowledging our wounds, we begin a process of truthfulness. And truth here means more than simply that the facts kind of fit our words or our language. In the Old Testament, the word that's often translated as truth in English also means reliability, dependability, steadfastness. In other words, truth is tied up with trust, our capacity to trust. And if you want, in the smallest possible way, to say what reconciliation is, it's about restoring trust, where trust has been broken. And trust is the most fundamental thing that makes it possible for us to be in relationship at all. We acknowledge wounds, and then we must also realize that deep wounds, and there are many deep wounds connected with the story of Cuba. I should here also say I have a Cuban sister-in-law who came here to Miami when she was about 8 years old. And she lives in Texas now. But we had quite a conversation when she found out I was coming down here today about this. Deep wounds never entirely heal. That is, they don't come to a point where they disappear and as though they never happened. They always somehow remain. The question then becomes how we relate to those wounds. I think for Christians, one of the most dramatic images we have is in John's Gospel, chapter 20, where Jesus appears to his disciples after the resurrection. He walks through a locked door. So his body has obviously been changed. It's his resurrection body. And then what does he do? He shows them the wounds in his hands and his side. Now, if you were designing a resurrection body that had been through torture, humiliation, abjection, and severe pain, ending with asphyxiation, that's what happens when you are crucified, what would be the first thing you'd want to get rid of? The wounds. But they're still there. And the question becomes, what does Jesus do with his wounds? I'll come back to that in a moment here. The wounds are still there, and what becomes important is how we relate to those wounds. If they remain open, they can become toxic. As we know, they become infected. They can become toxic for us and the people around us. And we see this in communities that have suffered a great deal. Some people cannot get over what has happened to them. And it can even turn into competition. My wounds are deeper than your wounds, so you have no right to address my wounds. This kind of thing goes on in these communities. I've worked a lot with the Vietnamese community, another community of people forced into exile. Where I live in Chicago. We have two large exile communities from the Second World War, Ukrainians and Lithuanians. And I've been able to observe what happened when they were able to go back. And I'll talk about that as we talk about the future here in a minute. But when they're toxic, they continue to control our lives. And so what does it mean when wounds heal? When wounds of loss, of betrayal, suffering, memory of traumatic events, it means the wounds no longer control our lives. They're still there. They can still be evoked. 2 days ago, 3 days ago, we remembered September 11th. And as I was thinking about, there's another important September 11th date that's very important for Latin American history. And that was the coup in Chile, 1973. That was also September 11th. But think of it here. People, who are immediately the survivors of those who died in the Twin Towers. Those wounds are still there. But the question is, do they control our lives? Or, if they heal sufficiently, can they become a means of healing others? I'd like to give you, just briefly here, my reading, it's perhaps a little idiosyncratic, but of Jesus and his wounds in John chapter 20. I'm going to be using a lot of examples out of Christian faith. One of the things that when we talk about the future I want to talk about is you have to have a moral platform to work out of and from if you're going to be engaged in the work of reconciliation. And that moral platform can be a commitment to human rights, a commitment to the dignity of every human being. It can be a religious one. Mine is clearly a religious one, but it doesn't exclude those others. Carlos Saladrigas, in his opening remarks, mentioned that the logic that creates conflict that same logic cannot solve the conflict. If that's the case, where else do you stand? That's the moral platform that I'll be talking here about in a minute. But let me give you, out of the three episodes in chapter 20 of John's Gospel. And the first one is with Magdalene, Mary Magdalene in the garden. She's looking for the body of Jesus. You probably remember the story, most of you. And someone comes up to her, and she thinks it's the caretaker, until he says her name. And then she realizes who it is, and she reaches out to embrace Jesus. And then rather enigmatically, Jesus says, "Don't touch me." In the next episode, he appears to his disciples, and he shows them his wounds. And in the third episode in this triptych, he invites Thomas to come touch his wounds, whereas 2 episodes earlier he told Magdalene not to touch him at all. Is there something going on here? Well, I think it teaches us something about wounds, both of individuals and of communities. In the first instance, with wounds, we don't know what to do with them. We may even try to hide them, fearing that if people find out we're wounded, they'll stay away from us as though the wounds are contagious. Perhaps Jesus didn't quite know what to do with his wounds, and that's why he said to Magdalene, "Don't touch me." By the second episode, he shows them his wounds, and sometimes we read that like, showing your identity card or your driver's license. Yeah, I'm the one. But it's also that he's in a point now that he realizes the wounds are really part of who he will be. And they have to figure into the relationships that he has. And by that third episode, where he invites Thomas to touch his wounds can become sources of healing for others. And with our deep wounds, if they come to that measure of healing, they can help with the healing of others. And the experience that the exile community has gone through, the experiences, become a resource, if they reach that level of healing, for the healing of Cuba. And the time comes when that can be done in a larger sort of way. What all of this teaches us, I think, about wounds comes back to what has already been said. We cannot look at reconciliation as a zero-sum game. It's not a matter of winning or losing. It's a matter of building relationships, our capacity to do that. And to the extent we are unable to heal because we refuse to heal, and there are people who want to stay victims, as long as that is the case, it's back really to a zero-sum game. Because the one who inflicted the wounds is winning. Is keeping us right where he wants us. We're going to see this is key for forgiveness as well. At that point, we become no longer victims. We become people whose wounds can heal others. People who have been tortured, who are able to get to this state, call themselves survivors. When we think of it socially, about Cuba, it might be better to say we are not victims anymore, we are citizens. In other words, part of the nation building that will need to go on. And this echoes what we have in one of the great passages about reconciliation in the New Testament, in the 2nd chapter of the letter to the Ephesians, which is about the reconciliation between Jews and Gentiles. And it's addressed to the Gentile community who feel that they're being pushed away by the Jewish community. And the passage says, "You were once far off, without covenant, without promise, but through Christ Jesus you have been brought near," and then goes to describe how Christ has done that. And then ends and says, "And now you are fellow citizens in the household of God, built upon the apostles and prophets with Jesus Christ as the cornerstone." We become full citizens in that particular way. So healing the past is an ongoing process. It's one that never is entirely completed. It is, of course, most important for the generation, the first generation, the generation who experienced exile, who experienced the situation in Cuba, prisons, re-education, the division of families, all of those kinds of things. It affects them the most. But it is never entirely complete because there can be parts of it that are within us that we don't even know that are there, that get evoked by certain things happening. Well, where's justice in all of this, in healing the past? Healing is a medical metaphor, but the issue of justice is often foremost in people's minds. So where does that fit? Justice, like reconciliation itself, has both a forward and a backward look, looking to the past, looking to the future. When many people who have been harmed talk about justice, they're talking about punishment, punishing the wrongdoers for what they have done. And that's an understandable and, I would say, also necessary feeling or emotion, because it's an affront to our dignity as human beings, as sons and daughters of God, that we have been treated in this fashion. We've been treated as less than human, as not mattering. The danger of this kind of justice, of course, is that the feelings can so overwhelm us that what we really want to do is sort of flatten our enemy. And that is using the logic of violence to end violence. And I think history teaches us pretty much that this doesn't help. You sometimes need to use that kind of force to stop things from happening. But there was a mention here earlier about Germany after the Second World War. Archbishop Wensky referred to it. I think we should also look at what happened to Germany after the First World War. This kind of total punishment was set in place. Heavy fines, loss of territory, and it was the seedbed for National Socialism. People were humiliated, they resented it, they found a strong leader, and we had another war. So justice has to be used with great prudence. It is important. As we'll see with forgiveness, forgiveness does not rule out punishment. So justice as it looks backward, and I want to use that as now a bridge to looking at the future. Justice also has a forward look. And it's discussed a lot today, particularly in the criminal justice system in this country and a number of other countries. It started in Norway. Punishment that's really, or justice that's restorative justice, justice that helps build a different kind of future, in which the wrongdoer is punished, but the punishment is meant to be the prelude to bringing the wrongdoer back into the community. So justice is central here. At the same time, we have to be realistic. Justice can only restore so much. It cannot bring back the dead. It cannot bring back the years that people have lost in separation and division or imprisonment. It can't bring any of those back. But the exercise of justice also says we are now living in a different kind of society that does not tolerate the things that have happened heretofore. So let's turn a little to look at the future. What does it mean to build the future? The first thing to say is the future is not going to be the past before all the bad stuff happened. Cuba, the future, will not be the Cuba of pre-1959. Because so much has changed. And all of you can answer this better than I. What made the revolution even acceptable in some quarters? Somebody must have been feeling that they weren't being treated well. But I don't want to dwell there. The thing is, we move to a different future. In one of the signature passages on reconciliation in the New Testament, in the second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 5, verse 17, it begins by saying, if anyone is in Christ, there is a new creation. What we are doing with the future here is a new creation. It's a creation that includes the past, does not forget the past, but has a different perspective on the past, and so brings it to a new place. And the key for working with building the new future is realizing just how things have changed. How in the healing, victims have changed. Many victims, for example, on the justice question, I've seen in some places, when it comes to getting justice, if their harm has been acknowledged and publicly, pronounced that they were harmed and should not have been harmed, what they did was not bad but was good, the need for justice, at least as punishment, is not nearly as strong anymore. Truth is a very powerful thing. The truth will make you free. Jesus says in John's Gospel, there's a certain freedom that comes with living in the truth. So we know we cannot go back to our pre-wounded lives. But those wounds, again, can no longer control what kind of future we may have. That's the important kind of thing. And around this point, I mentioned that in Chicago, where I am, we have a large Lithuanian and Ukrainian exile communities from right after the Second World War. They fled the communist regimes that were taking over there. In Ukraine, they had been there for a while, but it was an opportunity to leave. And in the intervening 40 years, they worked very hard to prepare to go back. So their children, rather than watching cartoons on Saturday morning, went to language school. So they would keep up the language. Well, 1990 came, and it was possible to go back. And some of the people I knew in the community who had been very strong leaders in this regard did go back. But most of them were back in Chicago in a couple of months. Because they said, this is not the Ukraine I remembered, nor is a Ukraine I would want to live in. And I think as we think about Cuba, and one of the great advantages and gifts you have at this point is the possibility to visit Cuba. It's not just an imagined place out there that recedes, in our memory because it's been so long since we've been there. What totalitarian regimes do to a society, they break down its civility. And the Archbishop referred to that already in terms of trust. And that's the thing that gets broken. Totalitarian regimes work to make every individual feel isolated and dependent upon the government. They do that by setting up spying systems where people report on each other. They undermine so many different patterns. Cubans, as I know you, are a very hard-working people. What happens to countries under those kinds of regimes is they cease to be hard-working because hard work doesn't get you anywhere. I spent 2 months last year in the former East Germany. And one of the remarkable things I noticed, they were reconstructing the building next to where I was living, which was the original building of the university from 1392. And there was more standing around than anything else. And I asked about this, and these are still patterns that are left over from the former East Germany. You were going to get paid, and it didn't make any difference. So people lack initiative. They lack sometimes ways of operating together. In the late 1990s, I was in Croatia a great deal. And I remember on one occasion, there was going to be a national dialogue between ministers out of the cabinet of the government and the bishops, and it was set up on the Capitol, which is this big plateau in the middle of Zagreb, but the cathedral is up there in the National Theater and so on. Well, in the National Theater, we had this with a full audience, and since I was from far away, they put me on the stage too. And of course, the whole thing was going on in Croatian. I don't speak Croatian. But after the dialogue, it was opened up to the public. And within 10 minutes, it was a shouting match. And I was sitting next to the Vice Prime Minister, and he leaned over and said to me, "You have to excuse us. We don't know how to talk to each other in public, because we've never been allowed to." So if you think rebuilding the future in Cuba, after 54 years, that's better than 2 generations of people who don't know how to operate in a civil society, but have found other ways of being together. That becomes a feature that we need to think about as we build the future. We know we have changed, if our wounds have healed to some measure. We need to know that the people there, and even the people in charge, have changed, and find that out. Separate the role from the person. No doubt, some of those who lead may not believe in the revolution anymore, but have nowhere else to go, or have advantages they know that they will lose if it moves otherwise. So what we need to do is work towards a future of right relationships. And the efforts that I know about, and I only know about a few of them that are coming from the Cuba Study Group, from some of the other groups who are represented here to Cuba, is a key element in the reconciliation process of building relationships, of building new social spaces where people can come together and learn to trust one another in public. I want to touch here on one particular item that is of real importance, and it's the generational issue. And I want to talk here about 3 generations. First generation. By first generation, I mean the people who left the island after, starting in 1959 or after 1959, who left the island as adults. In other words, their basic personalities and everything have been largely formed and came here or went to Spain or wherever. And then the second generation are those who came here as children or were born here shortly after their parents arrived. And the third generation are the children of the second generation, the grandchildren of the first generation. As you look around the world, what I've seen in so many places, that those in the first generation who suffered deep trauma from their experience will find it the most difficult to come to healing, because their personalities and everything have been largely formed, and it's hard to incorporate that kind of larger change. Some do. I'm not ruling that out. But as a pattern, this will be the case. The second generation, who came here as children, so completed their adolescence here, or were born here shortly thereafter, know the story of leaving Cuba largely from how it's been told to them by their parents. They want to be loyal to their parents' experience and sufferings, but they've also grown up in a little different world, a world that's not Cuba. So they find themselves sometimes in between, even in their loyalties. I noticed this, I mentioned I work a lot with the Vietnamese. Vietnamese was a high Confucian ethic. Your parents decide whom you're going to marry and what your profession is going to be. Well, the second generation of Vietnamese, there's huge conflict in those families because they're being socialized into a world that that says neither of those take place. And unfortunately, there's a significant suicide rate among young people, partially just trying to deal with that reality. And then the third generation, who admire their grandparents, want to hear the story, but this really doesn't connect with them at all. And it's often hard to keep their attention and interest in these topics. We have a large Jewish community in Chicago, as you do here in Miami. And when Holocaust Observance Day comes around in April each year, there's inevitably a story in the newspaper about elderly people going to temple, to synagogue, to commemorate this and working hard to get their grandchildren to come with them. Or I heard this in Hungary a couple of years ago. The young people saying, why do we have to talk about 1990 all the time? This happened before they were born. So engaging the young people becomes part of the task of building the future as well. So the things that are going to contribute to a genuinely civil society, understanding how people change ourselves, and it's going to be the case even with the wrongdoers, is essential in all of this. And the final thing about building the future I want to talk about is the delicate but necessary issue of forgiveness. Can forgiveness happen? The answer is yes, but I believe only at the end of a long process of healing. There cannot be cheap or quick forgiveness. Forgiveness is enjoined upon us in the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim tradition. And forgiveness is necessary. But it too is a process. It's not just a single act. The decision to forgive can be a single act. But getting there means having to review the relationships through which we have gone. I'd mentioned earlier that forgive and forget is a widespread adage that is put forward, and I think its principal purpose has been not to continue to carry the resentment and so on that continues to poison the atmosphere. But I would rather say when we forgive, we do not forget, but we remember in a different way. And it's learning how to remember in a different way that is key to forgiveness. Forgiveness, as I said, does not rule out punishment. People have to be held accountable for what has happened. Forgiveness begins when we're able to separate the wrongdoer from the deed. In other words, the wrongdoer is more than the deed that has happened. Be able to see that difference. And often what helps us do that is that moral platform out of which we operate. Some of you may have heard, she speaks a lot in this country, or read her memoir, Immaculée Ilibigisa, a Rwandan genocide survivor. It's called Truth to Tell, is her memoir. And the basis of the story is she lost her family, all of her family except one brother in the genocide. And she didn't lose the brother because he was not in the country at the time. He was in Senegal. But she was hidden along with 3 other women in an internal bathroom in the house of an evangelical pastor. She was Catholic. For 3 months, they lived in this bathroom. No windows. And she kept herself going by saying the rosary over and over again. Until one day, it was actually a day she could hear the genocidaires outside. It dawned on her, she said, they are children of God too. Now that can be a very abstract proposition that you hear in sermons and learned in catechism. But it took on a depth there and made it possible for her to begin forgiveness. Now what does forgiveness mean? It means giving up resentment. It means giving up the right to retaliate. It does not mean condoning the deed. It does not mean that the wrongdoer should not be punished, but you can treat the wrongdoer with dignity and respect. It may not be deep love for quite a while, if ever, but you can treat them with dignity and respect. And it's these kinds of things that make this possible. And this is what's constituted by this moral platform that we have. Christian faith provides a very deep basis for this, because the story of what God has done for the world is a story of reconciliation. God reconciling the world to himself. But the elements are there in the other traditions as well. Islam has strong elements in the Quran of both justice and forgiveness. Pope John Paul II, in his letter Message for the World Day of Peace in 2002, said that peace rests upon two pillars: justice and forgiveness. Justice and forgiveness. Justice is creating those right relationships. Forgiveness is about not letting the past utterly determine the future. It needs to be remembered, but not in a toxic way, not in a way that makes the future nothing more than the past. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who chaired the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, his memoir is called No Future Without Forgiveness. And that, in a nutshell, I believe, says what this is about. Forgiveness is a long path. It's not automatic and it's not instant, but it can happen. Well, let me conclude by sort of summarizing, if I may, what I think some of the tasks are that lie before us on the way to reconciliation. First of all, I've said, that healing the past, building the future are not sequential. First we finish healing the past, then we start building the future. They kind of they end up going together. The same is for the tasks of reconciliation. They're not in a sequence. So we aren't in a position to say, well, we first have to have regime change, political change. Then we can start working on economic change and then social change. First of all, it doesn't happen that way. And if you try to do it that way, it can be disastrous. I think this is what happened in Iraq. They had a good plan for how to get rid of Saddam Hussein, but they did not think beyond that of what would happen next until real chaos broke out. And that's why it's so important what you're doing here in your efforts to reach out to Cuba, to the people on the island. You don't build civil society overnight. You don't teach people the work habits that are necessary to build up businesses and sustain them in an instant. It's all of these ongoing contacts that start to build the networks of trust that will make a society, a different kind of society possible. So the future requires multiple strategies. It's not just one as we move forward in the processes of reconciliation. I think the overriding one, as we look from here, across to the island, is I think a big goal is how do we help the Cubans help themselves? One of the other things that happened when Canadians and U.S. exiles went back to Ukraine and Lithuania, there were stories from each of these countries. In both instances, there were people who had become quite wealthy and were really committed to helping those countries. Well, they went back to those countries and started bossing people around, saying, you don't know how to do this. And it was in Lithuania, I believe. Within 6 weeks, he was asked to leave. It was just so disruptive. So to help Cubans help themselves, regain their humanity too after living under a totalitarian regime. We're going to hear today from the experiences of elsewhere, and that is really key. Because there's no secret manual somewhere that teaches you how to do reconciliation processes. It's what we learn from each other that we're accumulating that's important. And the hope is that Cuba, the rebuilding of Cuba, will help in turn in other places as well. But let me just name a few things here that might get us underway. First is to create safe and hospitable or welcoming spaces where people can encounter each other. You know, often the formula, you'll hear in a case where there's been a totalitarian regime, nothing can be done until the wrongdoers admit they're wrong and apologize. Now, how many countries can you think of where that's happened? It's pretty hard to come up with much. If it happens at all, you've got to create the space where they can do this. Because they're leaping into the unknown if they try to do something like this. You have to create the space. So where we encounter as human beings, as caring communities, that people are people and not roles in a drama. New networks of connections. You're already doing this. Because it's those new networks that can create more just and sustainable social fabric. Key element two, and I know again a little about what goes on here, this is being done, but key is going to be helping the younger generations on both sides here and on the island get involved in their own ways in building the future. They may not be following our blueprints, but they need our encouragement and support because they're the long-term future. Learning from the successes and mistakes of others that have gone on in different places. And seeking, finally, ways of justice that are not revenge, because revenge perpetuates violence, but restores right relationships to build a different kind of future. And I think that's what we're here for, a sense that these openings, these doors and windows are opening, as Carlos Rodriguez said in his opening remarks, that they're there, of identifying them and using them as opportunities to build a different kind of Cuba. A Cuba that can indeed be home for Cubans everywhere. Thank you.